The file was 9 levels above classified. Not 3, not 5, 9. The kind of classification that required 3 separate government seals, a biometric confirmation from an active fleet admiral, and a written acknowledgment that the person requesting access understood they might never be allowed to leave the secure reading room once they'd finished. Cadet instructor Veleth of the Galactic Allied Academy had been teaching military history for 41 years. In that time, he had reviewed the service records of decorated generals, war criminals awaiting tribunal, and at least 2 individuals whose files contained personal notes from the Galactic Council itself. He had never, not once, encountered a file classified at level 9. The file belonged to a 19-year-old human girl sitting in the back row of his Introduction to Tactical Fundamentals class, trying very hard to look like she wasn't paying attention. Her name was Mara Voss. No relation. And in approximately 6 minutes, when cadet instructor Veleth finally received authorization to open what the Academy registrar had flagged as an administrative irregularity in her enrollment paperwork, everything he thought he knew about this unremarkable, quietly mocked, perpetually underestimated young woman was going to come apart like tissue paper in a rainstorm. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Mara had been at the Galactic Allied Academy for 4 months when the mockery settled into routine. It hadn't started cruelly. Most things don't. It had started with Cadet Dren Sohal, a Tirvani male, 7 feet of copper-scaled elegance with the kind of natural tactical intuition that made instructors weep with gratitude, leaning over during their first shared simulation exercise and asking, in a tone of genuine curiosity, "Has your species developed interstellar travel yet, or are you still working on the combustion engine?" The Tirvani didn't mean it as an insult. That was almost the worst part. He genuinely didn't know. Humans had joined the Galactic Allied Nations only 11 years ago, and the diplomatic process had been so quiet, so carefully managed, so thoroughly overshadowed by 3 simultaneous border conflicts with the Veleth Collective, that most species in the Allied nations had absorbed the news the way one absorbs information about a distant administrative change, noted, filed, forgotten. Mara had explained, calmly, that humans had achieved interstellar travel approximately 60 years prior, that they had a functioning fleet, that she, specifically, had grown up on a station orbiting a gas giant in the Kepler system. Dren Sohal had nodded politely and returned to his simulation, clearly filing this information in the same mental drawer as interesting but irrelevant. The real problem wasn't malice. The real problem was data. At the Academy, you were assessed constantly. Academic scores, simulation rankings, physical conditioning metrics, reaction time indexes, strategic pattern recognition scores, all of it logged, compared, displayed on the common room boards where every cadet could see exactly where they stood relative to everyone else. The Academy believed in transparency. The Academy believed that competition sharpened excellence. The Academy had not, apparently, considered what happened when one species had been flying warships for 3 centuries and another had been doing it for 60 years. Mara's scores were not bad. By any human military academy standard, they were exceptional. Her tactical theory scores placed her in the 94th percentile of her graduating class back home. Her instinct for asymmetric problem-solving, the ability to find unexpected solutions to problems that resisted conventional approaches, had been flagged by 2 separate instructors as remarkable. At the Galactic Allied Academy, she ranked 47th out of 52 in her cohort. 47th? Out of 52? The 5 cadets below her were a Meridian who was recovering from a neurological injury, 2 Selhari exchange students who were technically enrolled as observers and weren't supposed to be scored at all, a Veleth cadet who had joined the academy as part of a peace treaty arrangement and openly admitted she had no interest in military service, and a Tirvani cadet named Sorvan who was, by common consensus, the most spectacularly unmotivated individual to have enrolled in the academy in the last decade. Mara was, in other words, last among the cadets who were genuinely trying. She knew what they said about her. The academy's dormitory walls were not thick, and her hearing, a trait she had long ago stopped explaining as a human adaptation to centuries of predator-rich environments, was considerably better than most of her peers expected. "She tries," Dren Sohal said once to a cluster of third-year cadets, in the tone of someone offering the most charitable assessment they could manage. "You have to respect the effort." She asked instructor Veleth to repeat the sublight calculation 3 times. Said a Meridian cadet named Thessali Vorn, who was 14 years old and already ranked 9th in the cohort. 3 times, in front of everyone. Humans process mathematical abstraction differently, offered someone Mara didn't recognize. Their neural architecture is slower, said Thessalivorn. The word is slower. Mara, standing 6 inches from the wall on the other side of this conversation, carefully set down the stylus she had been holding because she had become aware that her grip was tight enough to break it. She did not break it. She set it down, picked up a different one, and went back to her work. This was a thing she did. This careful, deliberate redirection of energy. Her academy counselor, a well-meaning Selhari named Counselor Oren Besh, who smelled faintly of something like cinnamon and always looked mildly alarmed when Mara entered the room, had gently suggested, twice, that Mara might be overextending herself in an unfamiliar environment, and that there was no shame in requesting a transfer to a human-specific preparatory program. Mara had thanked her, and not transferred. She was here for a reason. Several reasons, actually. Though she kept them arranged in a specific internal order that she did not share with anyone. The topmost reason was simple: she was good at this. Not good by the Academy's metrics, which were designed around species that had been waging organized interstellar warfare since before humans had figured out that the Earth was round. Good in a way that the metrics didn't have categories for yet. Good in the way that a person who has spent years learning to fight with whatever is available becomes good, not elegant, not orthodox, not easily quantified, but effective in a bone-deep way that tends to announce itself at the worst possible moments for whoever is standing on the other side. The second reason she did not think about too much. It had to do with a word she'd seen on a form once, in a file she wasn't supposed to have been able to access, in a year she didn't talk about. The word was precedent, and it was written next to her name, and she had spent a long time trying to understand what it meant in context, before she had quietly put the memory away in a place she didn't visit often. The third reason was that she was 19 years old, and constitutionally incapable of walking away from something that felt unfinished. The incident that changed everything began, absurdly, with a group project. Instructor Vosrethan, the kind of teacher who had clearly been brilliant once and still occasionally allowed glimpses of that brilliance to surface before retreating behind the comfortable fortress of received curriculum, assigned the cohort's first major collaborative exercise in their 8th week. 6 groups of 8 to 9 cadets, each group assigned a famous historical engagement from the last 3 centuries of Galactic Allied military history. Objective: reconstruct the tactical decision tree, identify the points of failure, propose alternative strategies that might have changed the outcome. Mara's group was assigned the Siege of Veleth Station. This was, by common consensus among the cadets, the worst possible assignment. The Siege of Veleth Station was not famous for being a brilliant tactical exercise. It was famous for being a catastrophe of such thorough and comprehensive proportions that military historians still used it as a teaching example for what they called cascading command failure, the phenomenon whereby every decision made in response to a crisis somehow managed to make the crisis worse. The Galactic Allied fleet had lost 4 frigates, 2 carriers, and approximately 900 personnel in an engagement that military models suggested they should have won with a loss rate of less than 12%. No one had ever proposed an alternative strategy that worked. The simulation had been run 47 times by cadets at this academy alone. It had been run hundreds of times by professional military analysts. Every single time, the outcome was the same. The Allied fleet lost. Sometimes faster, sometimes slower. Always lost. Dren Sohal, whose group had been assigned the comparatively prestigious Battle of the Korvath Passage, expressed his sympathy with the kind of generous condescension that was somehow worse than contempt. "Bad luck," he said. "The Veleth assignment is basically decorative. Vosrethan gives it to groups he doesn't expect much from." Mara's group comprised herself, 2 Tervani cadets, one of whom was the famously unmotivated Sorvan, who had apparently been placed in her group as a form of punishment for someone, a Meridian named Cadet Oles, a Selhari pair who worked almost exclusively as a unit, a human-adjacent species called Fenari whose cadet was named Thresh, and a quiet Vethran cadet called Isenthal who sat slightly apart from the others and rarely spoke. Their first meeting lasted 40 minutes and produced nothing useful. The second meeting lasted an hour and produced the consensus that the assignment was, in Sorvan's memorable phrasing, a burial with extra steps. The third meeting was the one Mara had been waiting for. She came to the third meeting with 53 pages of notes, not simulation outputs, not the Academy's standard tactical analysis frameworks, notes, written longhand, an affectation several of her group members found eccentric, in a dense, compressed script that filled every available millimeter of the pages she'd requisitioned from the Academy's old format supply room because the standard digital notation systems didn't organize information the way her mind organized it. She put the pages on the table. Cadet Oles, the Meridian, looked at them the way one might look at a large and unfamiliar animal that had entered the room. "What is that?" "The answer," Mara said, "or close to it. I need to run a simulation to check something, but I think I know why everyone fails the Veleth scenario." There was a pause of the particular quality that Mara had learned to recognize at the Academy, the pause that preceded either dismissal or reluctant engagement, and which was distinguished from genuine curiosity primarily by the absence of follow-up questions. Sorvin leaned back in his chair and examined the ceiling. The Selhari pair exchanged a glance. Cadet Oles picked up one of the pages, turned it sideways and set it back down. Isen Thal, the Vathran, looked at the pages for a moment and then looked at Mara. "Why does everyone fail the Veleth scenario?" she asked. It was the first full sentence Mara had heard her say. Mara pulled a chair to the head of the table and sat down. "Because," she said, "everyone assumes the problem is tactical." The presentation her group delivered was not what Instructor Vosrathan had been expecting. What he had been expecting, based on 41 years of assigning the Veleth scenario to groups he was gently preparing for disappointment, was a competent reconstruction of the known tactical failures, followed by several simulated alternatives that each failed in slightly different ways. It was a learning exercise. The lesson was supposed to be about the limits of after-action analysis. It was supposed to produce humility. What Mara's group delivered instead was a complete reframing of every assumption that had governed the engagement analysis for 32 years. The siege of Veleth Station had always been analyzed as a military failure. The Allied fleet had made poor tactical decisions. The commanders had been overconfident. The Vethran Collective's defensive systems had been underestimated. The sub-light approach vector had been compromised by a sensor blind spot that the Fleet Intelligence Division had failed to flag. Standard cascading command failure. Tragic but comprehensible. Mara had looked at it from a different angle. "The fleet wasn't outfought," she said, standing at the front of the presentation room while her group sat in a careful semicircle behind her, arranged according to a dynamic she had quietly established over the previous 3 weeks through a combination of genuine interest in each of their capabilities and patient strategic positioning that none of them had fully noticed. The fleet was managed. Someone on the inside was feeding adjusted coordinates to the navigation systems, not enough to be obvious, just enough to matter. The room was quiet. "That's not in any of the official analyses," Instructor Vosrathan said carefully. "No," Mara agreed, "it's not. The official analyses have access to the tactical logs, the command recordings, and the post-engagement reports. They don't have access to the original navigation telemetry, because the navigation telemetry was archived at Veleth Station itself, and Veleth Station was destroyed in the engagement." She paused. The Academy's Historical Records Division received a partial data recovery from a secondary archive buoy 6 years ago. It's been logged as fragmentary and inconclusive. I requested access to it. Instructor Vosrathan was very still. "That archive material is not part of the standard assignment research package." "No," Mara said again, "but it's available. I asked the Records Division. They said it was rarely requested because it's only partially recovered, and most cadets find it too fragmentary to be useful." A beat. "I found it useful." The silence in the room had changed quality. It was no longer the comfortable silence of an instructor managing expectations. It was something attentive and slightly uncertain. "The navigation telemetry fragments," Mara continued, "show micro-corrections in the fleet's approach vectors at 3 specific intervals. Each correction is within the system's standard automatic error compensation range, so they wouldn't have triggered alerts. But they're not random. If you map them against the Vethran defensive grid, the one that wasn't in the Allied intelligence files, but that I reconstructed from the engagement outcome vectors using the method that's in Appendix C of the 31st Tactical Analysis Handbook, which I know isn't standard curriculum until 3rd year, but it's in the library. The micro-corrections position the fleet precisely inside the blind spots of the Allied defensive pickets while simultaneously moving them within optimal targeting range of the Vethran long-range batteries." She let that sit for a moment. The fleet didn't fail. The fleet was guided to failure by someone with access to the navigation systems and enough knowledge of both the Allied and Vethran tactical configurations to execute it without triggering a single alert. Instructor Vosrathan said nothing for a long time. "The alternative strategy," Mara said, moving to the simulation display, "isn't a tactical change, it's an intelligence change. If the Allied command had run a real-time correlation check on their own navigation telemetry against their expected vectors, a process that takes 40 seconds and that no one runs because no one expects their own systems to be compromised, they would have identified the interference in the first approach window. At that point, the engagement becomes a completely different problem, one they had the resources to win. She showed the simulation. It worked, not perfectly, not elegantly, but it worked. The Allied fleet, given 40 seconds of accurate self-diagnostic intelligence, survived the engagement with a loss rate of 11%, exactly within the original model's predicted range. The room remained quiet for long enough that Mara began to count silently, which was something she did when she was nervous and trying not to show it. She reached 11 before Instructor Voss Rethan spoke. "Cadet Voss," he said slowly, "this analysis, if it's correct, would represent a significant revision of the historical record regarding the siege of Veleth Station." "Yes," Mara said. "Do you understand the implications of there was a traitor," Mara said, "or a long-term intelligence asset, someone with access to Allied fleet navigation systems in the Veleth engagement? They haven't been identified. In 32 years no one identified them, partly because no one was looking, and partly because the evidence only becomes visible when you combine 3 datasets that aren't normally analyzed together." She paused. "I think the Academy should probably notify the relevant authorities. I have all my working documentation. It's in the appendix." Instructor Voss Rethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the documentation. Then he excused the class. The fallout from the Veleth analysis was not immediate, because the institutions involved moved slowly and carefully, and because several people needed to confirm that a first-year cadet had genuinely done what it appeared she had done before anyone said anything out loud that they would later have to account for. But within the cohort, things shifted. Not dramatically. Not with the clean narrative satisfaction of sudden respect earned and mockery retracted. It wasn't like that. It was subtler. A change in the quality of attention when Mara spoke in class. A pause before dismissal that hadn't been there before. Dren Sohal asking her, once with visible effort, to explain her reasoning on a simulation problem before declaring her approach wrong. Thessali Vorn, the 14-year-old prodigy, watching Mara work from across the common room with an expression that was not quite admiration, but had stopped being contempt. Isen Thal, the veteran, started sitting next to her at meals. Mara did not make the mistake of thinking this meant she had arrived somewhere. She understood, with the precise clarity of someone who has learned to read rooms as a survival skill, that she had earned a question mark where there had previously been a period. She had not earned trust. She had not earned respect. She had earned the possibility of eventually earning those things, which was a start. She kept working. Her simulation scores began to improve, not because she had suddenly become better at the formal tactical frameworks the Academy tested. She remained mediocre at the standard exercises, but because several of her instructors, quietly recalibrated, had begun to notice the ways her approaches worked that weren't reflected in the scoring rubric. She developed a reputation, carefully and somewhat reluctantly assigned, as someone who found things other people missed. It wasn't enough to significantly move her cohort ranking. She was 39th now, instead of 47th, which was progress, but she was still in the bottom half of a class that increasingly seemed to regard her as an interesting anomaly rather than a genuine peer. She did not tell anyone what she was thinking about when she was quiet at her desk in the long institutional evenings, working through material she'd requested from archives and departments that were not part of the standard curriculum. She did not tell anyone about the things she'd noticed in the 3rd week, looking at the Academy's enrollment records as part of a research project on interspecies military integration that she'd proposed to Instructor Voss Rethan as independent coursework. The things she'd noticed, which she had quietly confirmed and then quietly filed away, which was that her own enrollment file had a flag on it she'd never put there, in a classification level she shouldn't have been able to see even the existence of, containing a reference number that matched the format of a Galactic Allied Special Operations record. She had been trying to decide what to do about this for 4 months. She had not yet decided. Then the Commemorative Assessment arrived, and the decision was made for her. The Commemorative Assessment was an annual tradition at the Academy, a full cohort tactical simulation weighted heavily in the year-end scores, conducted on the anniversary of the founding of the Galactic Allied Nations. It was ceremonial in origin and serious in execution. All first-year cadets participated. The simulation was drawn from real historical engagements, stripped of identifying information, and required each cadet to demonstrate individual tactical decision-making under pressure. This year's scenario, announced the morning of the assessment with the Academy's characteristic commitment to removing preparation time, was the Hadronite Corridor Defense. Mara, sitting at her assigned terminal in the assessment hall, read the scenario parameters and felt something happen in her chest that was not quite a physical sensation, but was close to one. The Hadronite Corridor Defense. She knew this scenario. She knew it better than she knew the layout of this building, better than she knew the Academy's grading rubric, better than she knew almost anything she'd learned in 4 months of formal education. She knew it the way you know something that has been part of your life in a way that isn't academic. She checked the scenario parameters again, then again, looking for something she was half hoping she wouldn't find. She found it. The scenario was based on real events. The strip of identifying information process was thorough but not perfect, because it relied on changing names and unit designations while keeping the tactical parameters accurate. Otherwise, the simulation wouldn't model correctly. The Hadronite Corridor Defense had been, she knew, a classified engagement, Level 7 classification on the official record. She knew this because she had at one point seen the classification level. She had seen it on a form that she wasn't supposed to have been able to access, on a day she didn't think about, written next to a reference number that she had subsequently noticed in her own enrollment file. The scenario in front of her was the Hadronite Corridor Defense. She had 3 hours to complete the assessment. She spent the first 40 seconds sitting completely still, breathing carefully through her nose, doing a thing she had learned to do in circumstances that required her to be entirely present and entirely controlled at the same time, which was to locate the part of herself that was frightened and acknowledge it with the same professional courtesy she might extend to an unexpected variable in a tactical model, and then set it aside. Then she opened the simulation and began. Instructor Vos Rethan noticed something wrong at the 50-minute mark. He was monitoring cadet performance across the assessment hall, a standard practice, watching for cadets who were struggling significantly, managing the technical issues that always arose with 47 simultaneous simulation terminals running at full complexity. He wasn't paying particular attention to any individual cadet. He was doing rounds. He stopped at Mara's terminal. She wasn't struggling. She wasn't slowing down. She wasn't doing any of the things that a cadet ranked 39th in her cohort did during a major assessment scenario. She was moving through the simulation with the fluid, unhesitating confidence of someone who had done this before, not run this specific simulation before but done this, made these specific kinds of decisions, at this specific pace, under this specific category of pressure. The decision trees she was building were not standard Academy frameworks. They were custom, built on the fly from first principles, incorporating variables that the standard frameworks didn't weigh, producing outcomes that the Academy's simulation model was generating with a yellow flag because they were statistically unusual. Yellow flags in the simulation meant the model was having difficulty categorizing what was happening. Yellow flags were rare. In 41 years, Vos Rethan had seen yellow flags perhaps 24 times, always from cadets who were performing at an exceptional level on specific problem types. He had never seen what he saw when he looked at the overview of Mara's simulation. Every single decision, yellow flagged. He stood behind her terminal for 7 minutes, watching. She didn't look up. She was in the kind of concentrated state that serious tactical operators described, sometimes, as being in the corridor. The experiential phenomenon where the boundaries of self and scenario blurred and the decisions stopped feeling like decisions and started feeling like responses. He had taught for 41 years. He had seen perhaps 5 cadets enter that state during an assessment. He walked to the assessment hall's administrative terminal and opened Mara Vos's enrollment file. This was a routine action. Instructors accessed cadet files regularly. The files were structured so that academic and assessment information was immediately available while personal and background information required a secondary confirmation. He confirmed. The file opened. He read what was available. Then he reached the classification flag, visible to him because his instructor clearance allowed him to see the existence of flags without seeing their contents, and stopped. Level 9. He read the number 3 times. Then he accessed the Academy's administrative system and formally requested file access authorization, which would require review by the registrar, the Academy commandant, and at least one representative of the Galactic Allied Military Records Office. He returned to the assessment hall to watch Mara complete the simulation. She finished with 40 minutes to spare. Her score, when the model processed it, broke the Academy's 30-year record for the Hadrani corridor scenario. Not by a small margin, by a margin that caused the scoring system to flag the result for manual review, because it was outside the range the system had been designed to consider possible for a first-year cadet. Mara sat back in her chair, looked at the completed simulation for a moment, and then looked up and found instructor Veleth Analysis watching her. Neither of them spoke. After a moment she looked back at the simulation. The authorization came through the following morning. This was in the opinion of the Galactic Allied Military Records Office liaison who processed the request extraordinarily fast. Level 9 authorizations typically took a minimum of 2 weeks and sometimes substantially longer. This one was processed overnight. She had noted in her access log that the processing speed seemed to suggest someone had been expecting the request. She had noted this and then decided it was above her pay grade and moved on. Instructor Veleth received the authorization at 0700. By 0730 he had notified Academy Commandant Sir Rev. Voss, no relation to the cadet, in a coincidence that had been mildly noted at the time of enrollment and then forgotten, that he would be reviewing classified material in the secure reading room and that she might want to be present. She was present, as was the Academy's intelligence liaison, a retired Turvani admiral named Vorkishal, who had been stationed at the Academy for 3 years, and who, upon hearing the classification level, arrived at the secure reading room 17 minutes before the scheduled access time and declined to explain how he'd learned about it. The file was displayed on the secure terminal. They read it in silence. Commandant Sir Voss was, by reputation and by evidence, not easily surprised. She had administered the Academy for 11 years. She had handled crisis situations, political entanglements, disciplinary catastrophes, the occasional cadet who turned out to be a foreign intelligence asset, and once, an incident involving a Meridian cadet and a species-restricted substance that had resulted in 2 weeks of extraordinary paperwork and a permanent notation in the Academy's operational guidelines. She was a woman of considerable composure. She read Mara Voss's classified file, and she said nothing for a very long time. Admiral Vorkishal read the file. He had been a flag officer for 20 years. He had participated in 6 significant military engagements. He had reviewed hundreds of classified documents. He set down the hard copy section he'd been handed. Some portions of the file were document only, no digital transmission permitted, and he said, quietly, "Ancestors." Instructor Veleth had already read the file twice by this point. He said nothing because he couldn't think of anything adequate to say. He was thinking about a 19-year-old girl sitting in the back of his classroom trying very hard to look like she wasn't paying attention. He was thinking about 41 years of teaching and the fact that he had assigned her to the group he didn't expect much from. The file contained the following. Mara Voss, currently enrolled as a first-year cadet, had not always been Mara Voss. The name she was enrolled under was a legal name change processed 2 years prior through a human government administrative channel that was specifically designated for individuals entering formal protective anonymization protocols. The administrative channel in question was maintained jointly by the human government and the Galactic Allied Special Operations Directorate. The individual enrolled as Mara Voss had previously been known, in the operational record, as Specialist Voss. No first name given in the unclassified portions, replaced throughout with a designation of the Human Special Operations Detachment, Ghost Formation 7. Ghost Formation 7 had been active for 3 years. It was a joint Human Allied Special Operations Unit, one of 12 formed as part of a classified integration protocol that had been run alongside the public diplomatic process because certain members of the Galactic Allied Military Council had taken the position, quietly and unofficially, that you did not fully understand what you were allying yourself with until you had watched them work in the field. Ghost Formation 7 had been assigned to the Hadrani Corridor Defense. The Hadrani Corridor Defense was a 72-hour engagement in which a combined veteran separatist force had attempted to seize control of a logistics hub that would have effectively ended the border stabilization process and reignited a full-scale conflict that military models suggested would cost between 4 and 7 million lives. The Allied force assigned to the corridor defense had consisted of 2 frigates, a Marine detachment, and Ghost Formation 7. Total personnel approximately 300. The opposing force had been significantly larger. The file contained a section titled Engagement Summary that ran to 47 pages. The 3 people in the secure reading room had been in the room for 2 hours, and they were on page 31. On page 31 there was a notation. It was the kind of notation that appeared in military records when something happened during an engagement that the authors of the record felt required specific documentation, but for which the standard reporting framework was not entirely adequate. It was headed Field Decision Record, Individual Action, and it described, in the clipped, precise language of official military documentation, what had happened on Hour 59 of the Hadronite Corridor defense when the commanding officer of Ghost Formation 7 was incapacitated by hostile fire and the ranking human specialist, 15 years old at the time, the file noted, which was 3 years below the minimum age for the detachment she was serving in, an irregularity that had been authorized under emergency protocols by 2 different flag officers whose names were redacted, had assumed effective tactical command of the remaining force. The notation described the decisions that had been made over the following 13 hours. The tribunal that later reviewed them had used the word unprecedented 4 times. They had also used the words strategically sound, operationally effective, and, in one section that the tribunal chair had clearly written personally rather than through the standard documentation process, the most instinctive example of multi-domain tactical integration we have reviewed in the 30 years this tribunal has operated. The Hadronite Corridor had held. The logistics hub had not been seized. The border stabilization process had continued. The file noted that of the approximately 300 Allied personnel in the engagement, 211 had survived. The file noted that military models run retroactively against the engagement parameters without the field decisions recorded in pages 8 through 47, projected a survival rate of between 12 and 22%. The file noted that the discrepancy between the projected outcome and the actual outcome was attributable, in the tribunal's assessment, to the field decisions made by the ranking human specialist during the final 13 hours of the engagement. On page 37, there was a single paragraph under the heading Commendation Record that read, in its entirety, "The actions of Specialist Voss during the Hadronite Corridor defense represent the highest standard of military service and personal courage. This commendation is issued at the highest classification level permitted under current protocols and may not be disclosed, referenced, or acknowledged in any official capacity without authorization from the Galactic Allied Military Council. Specialist Voss has been informed of the commendation and of the terms of its classification and has acknowledged same." On page 38, there was a brief psychological assessment that noted, with clinical precision, that the specialist had declined formal psychological support following the engagement, had requested instead to be enrolled in the standard military education pipeline with the appropriate anonymization protocols, and had stated, when asked by the assessing officer what she hoped to gain from the experience, "I want to learn what I don't know yet." Commandant Servos finished the file. She sat for a moment. Then she said, "Instructor Voss Rethan." "Yes, what is Cadet Voss's current cohort ranking?" He knew the answer. 39th, he said, out of 52. The commandant looked at the document in front of her for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "We've been doing this wrong." The all-cohort assembly was not unusual. The academy held them periodically for various administrative and ceremonial purposes. The cadets arrived that morning in the standard way, organized by cohort, seated by precedence ranking, which meant that Mara, at 39th, was near the back, surrounded by the familiar faces of the lower-ranked cadets she'd spent 4 months sitting near. She had not been told what the assembly was for. No one had. The notification had simply indicated mandatory attendance and formal dress, which was standard. She sat in her seat and looked at the front of the room with the patient, attentive stillness that most of her cohort had long since stopped reading as anything other than the particular blankness of someone who wasn't quite following along. Isentho, sitting to her left, noticed that Mara's hands, resting in her lap, were entirely relaxed. Not the deliberate relaxation of someone controlling themselves, actually relaxed. She filed this away without knowing what to do with it. Commandant Servos opened the assembly. She spoke for approximately 3 minutes about the Academy's commitment to honest assessment and genuine excellence. She spoke about the difference between measuring performance and understanding capability. She spoke, briefly, about the history of the Galactic Allied Nations and the principles under which it had been founded. Then she said, "There is a member of the first-year cohort whose file I am authorized, effective this morning, to partially disclose. I want to be clear about what partially means in this context. The full record remains classified. What I am about to share has been approved by the Galactic Allied Military Council specifically because the Council has determined that the Academy's educational mission is best served by accurate information." She paused. Cadet Mara Voss. The assembly hall was large enough that the silence had physical dimension. Mara looked at the commandant. She did not visibly react, which was noted by approximately 40 of the 51 people who were looking at her. "Cadet Voss," the commandant said, "would you stand, please?" Mara stood. "I am going to tell this cohort some things," Commandant Servos said. "I'm going to ask you to let me do that, because they need to hear it." A pause. "Yes, ma'am." The commandant spoke for 12 minutes. She did not read from the file. She described it. She described the Hadrani corridor defense in the careful, selected terms that had been approved for partial disclosure. She described the engagement parameters. She described the outcome. She described the tribunal's findings. She described a 15-year-old human girl making decisions in the 59th hour of a 72-hour engagement that 211 people had survived because of. She said the word unprecedented 4 times. She said the phrase highest standard of military service once. She said, "Cadet Voss enrolled in this academy, under a protected identity, because she wanted to learn what she didn't know yet." I want the cohort to hear that, not because it's a remarkable reason, although it is, but because I think it is the correct reason, and I think it should be the reason all of you are here. The hall was completely silent. Dren Sohal was looking at the back of Mara's head with an expression that his face wasn't quite built for, a combination of things that the Tervani emotional palette had words for individually, but no composite term for in combination. Thessaly Vorn, 14 years old and 9th in the cohort, was very still. The 5 cadets who ranked below Mara were sitting with the particular quality of stillness that occurs when a Category 1 has been using to organize the world is quietly and irrevocably removed. Instructor Vasrathan was looking at his hands. The commandant said, "Cadet Voss, on behalf of the Galactic Allied Academy, I owe you an apology. The institutional systems by which we rank and assess our cadets failed to account for what you bring to this academy and to this work. We will be reviewing those systems." She paused. "I also want to say, on behalf of the Galactic Allied Nations, thank you." The silence stretched. Mara stood in the back of the assembly hall, 39th in her cohort, in the formal dress uniform that had never quite fit correctly because the Academy's uniform specifications weren't fully calibrated for human physiology yet, and she looked at the commandant, and she nodded once. "Thank you, ma'am," she said. Her voice was clear and level and carried the kind of steadiness that has nothing to do with not feeling things and everything to do with having a great deal of practice at feeling them without being moved off course. She sat back down. Eisenthal, on her left, said nothing. After a moment she placed her hand briefly on Mara's arm, a veteran gesture that Mara had learned, from a reference text she'd requested in her 3rd week, signified something that didn't translate precisely but was closest to "I see you." Mara looked at her hand. Then she looked up at Eisenthal. "I know," she said quietly. "Thank you." After the assembly, the cohort moved to the common room in the particular dispersed way of a group that has received significant information and has not yet processed it into behavior. People collected near the beverage stations and the window alcoves and the study tables and talked in low voices or didn't talk at all. Dren Sohal found Mara at one of the study tables, sitting with her notebook open, writing something. She was always writing something. He stood at the edge of the table for a moment before she looked up. "I said," he began, and then stopped, and started again. "The first week, I asked if your species had developed interstellar travel yet." "I remember," Mara said. "I didn't mean," he stopped. "No, I did mean it the way it came out. I meant it as a measurement. I was deciding where you ranked." He paused. "I was wrong about the measurement. And I was wrong to rank you at all before I knew anything about you." Mara looked at him for a moment. Dren Sohal was, she had assessed fairly early, fundamentally decent, the kind of person whose arrogance was mostly a product of a context that had never given him reason to revise it, rather than anything more deep-seated. "You weren't wrong that I'm behind," she said. "I am behind. I'm genuinely bad at the sublight calculations. I had to ask 3 times because I actually didn't understand it. But the other things, I'm not behind at," she agreed. "But you couldn't see those things. The Academy's framework couldn't see those things. That's not entirely your fault." She paused. "It's something worth fixing." He sat down across from her. This was not something he had planned to do, but there was something about the way she spoke, not forgiving exactly, but willing to continue, that made it seem like the right next step. "How did you—" He stopped. "How are you not angry?" Mara considered this seriously, which he had come to recognize as a habit of hers, the willingness to treat questions as though they deserved actual answers. "I am angry," she said. I've been angry since the first week, but I decided early on that I had a limited amount of energy and I could spend it on being angry at the people who were measuring me wrong, or I could spend it on getting better at the things I was actually bad at and figuring out how to make visible the things I wasn't bad at. She looked at her notebook. The second option seemed more useful. Drin Sohal was quiet for a moment. The Veleth Analysis, he said. That wasn't just for the assignment, was it? You were actually interested in it. Someone was hidden in that record for 32 years, Mara said. That seemed worth finding. He nodded slowly. Then he said carefully. The Hadarani Corridor Defense. It's in the simulation library. Everyone's failed it. I've run it 3 times. A pause. What did you see that we didn't? Mara looked at him for a moment. Then she turned her notebook around. She talked for 40 minutes. By the end, they had been joined by Thessaly Vorn, who had appeared silently and positioned herself within listening range during the second minute and had not moved since. By Cadet Oles, who had pulled up a chair and was taking notes on his own tablet, and by 3 other cadets who had drifted over with the particular purposeful-seeming casualness of people who want to listen to something but don't want to appear too eager about it. Yisenthal was already there. She had been there from the beginning. Mara talked. She talked about the things she'd seen in the Hadrani scenario. The ways the simulation's parameters matched the real engagement she remembered, the decision points, the logic that had driven her choices. She talked about the ways the Academy's standard tactical frameworks were powerful and sophisticated, and also had specific blind spots that were worth knowing about. She talked about the relationship between formal training and operational experience, and the ways they could reinforce or contradict each other. She talked the way she always talked when she was working through something she found genuinely interesting, not performing knowledge, not positioning herself, but thinking out loud actively in a way that invited other minds to participate. At some point during the second half of the conversation, she glanced up and found more than a dozen people around the table and registered this fact and returned to what she was saying. She was not 47th. She was not 39th. In this room, at this table, with these people, she had never been ranked at all. She was just herself, a 19-year-old who had been through things that would have broken some people and had come out the other side with the specific kind of clarity that only comes from having tested yourself against the actual weight of what is asked of those who take on responsibility for others. She would realize later, exactly where she had intended to be. Not because the commandant had spoken, not because the file had been opened and the record had been partially disclosed, and the silence in the assembly hall had said things that years of cohort rankings never had. Those things had happened, and they mattered, but they weren't why she was here. She was here because she wanted to learn what she didn't know yet, and she had found, in the last 4 months, in the back rows and the archive requests and the missed sublight calculations and the 53 pages of longhand notes and the assessment simulation and the quiet accumulating presence of people who had gradually, reluctantly, honestly changed their minds about her, she had found that she was in fact learning, not just tactics, not just the formal frameworks and the classified histories and the technical gaps that 4 months of intensive work had begun to close. She was learning how to be known. That was, she had decided, probably the harder skill. And she was only at the beginning of it. She kept talking. The afternoon light came through the common room windows at an angle that was different from any light she'd grown up with, in a building on a planet that wasn't hers, surrounded by people who were not human and who had not, until very recently, seen her clearly, and who were now, with the effortful and genuine attention of individuals revising a conclusion they'd been certain of, beginning to try. It was not a perfect ending. She was still 39th in her cohort by official record, though the commandant had indicated that the ranking system was under review. She was still genuinely bad at sublight calculations, and planned to ask for extra instruction, which would probably be embarrassing in the specific way that needing help is always slightly embarrassing and also necessary. The uniform still didn't fit correctly. The Academy's adjustment process for human-specific requirements was apparently going to take another semester. There was a lot of work still to do. That had always been true. She had, for as long as she could remember, preferred it that way.